On a hot summer evening in 1904, over 30 men set out on a race that included hitchhiking, dehydration, and poisoning. It happened like this. Welcome to the episode. This week we'll be going back in time over 100 years to the 1904 Olympic Games. These were no ordinary games. They happened in conjunction with the World Fair in St. Louis. This World Fair in particular celebrated the 100-year purchase of Louisiana from the French Republic. And this fair was on a huge scale. It covered over 1,200 acres, 1,500 buildings, and 75 miles of road and walkways. 19 million people attended the fair from over 50 different countries and 43 of the then 45 states. The fair would have showcased American innovations in communication, medicine, and transportation. This would include things like the wireless telephone, the X-ray machine, and the personal automobile. So you can imagine for people attending the fair, this would have been incredible. It would have been like nothing they would have seen before. And a chief organizer of the 1904 Olympics and part of this World Fair was John Sullivan, a white supremacist. For him, the Olympics and some of the events were supposed to showcase white athletic supremacy and civilized life, I guess. He had some really strange beliefs and ideas, one of them being purposeful dehydration. Athletes were not supposed to eat or drink because apparently a full stomach was bad. But he also helped organise what was known as the Anthropology Days. The Anthropology Days were essentially human zoos. They displayed thousands of indigenous people in makeshift habitats that was supposed to mimic their own natural homes or habitats. So, as well as walking around and seeing all these innovations in communication and technology, you also had these displays of indigenous people, which is so strange to think about now, but I guess in years to come when we think about animal zoos, we'll probably think that was really strange. I guess a lot of people would say animal zoos are strange today, but John O'Sullivan was an organizer of the Olympics. But he also set up these side events, these sporting events at the Anthropology Days. This is where he paid indigenous people to compete in events that they wouldn't have any training or experience in. So like track and field, running and jumping, archery, displays of strength. These were mainly watched by white people. So I guess it kind of had a circus feel. And, you know, it goes along with the theme of like human zoos and people being on display. And then, of course, there was the marathon itself, which we'll learn over the next while was the craziest race of all time. It did have some firsts, though. It had the first two black Africans to compete in the Olympics. Two Tswana men named, and apologies if I don't pronounce these names correctly, but Len Twanyane and Jan Mashiani. Now they both happened to be in St. Louis as part of the South African Boer War exhibit. They had been messengers for the Boers and performed twice a day in the exhibit for, again, white spectators. They would have had no formal racing or training experience. And the marathon itself was not standardized at that time. So in St. Louis, the course was nearly 25 mile, or roughly 40 kilometers. And the layout was essentially, they would start in the stadium, which was newly built. They would run 5 laps of the stadium, and the rest of the course was on country roads with race officials riding in vehicles ahead of and behind the runners. And the course would eventually end up back in the stadium. So you had this kind of a bizarre background to the event anyway, with this huge kind of circus feel to it with the fair happening. And from there, things just got more bizarre. And a lot of that was because of the organisation from John Sullivan and his bizarre ideas. So, before the race even began, things went wrong. Only 32 of the 40 who were registered to turn up actually showed up to the race. But those 32 men stood and started the race. And in another first of the marathon, Frank Pierce, who was from the Seneca Nation and the first Native American to compete in the Olympics, took first place. He was followed closely behind a couple of names, a couple of American runners. You had Arthur Newton, Thomas Hicks, and Sam Miller. As the men reached the third lap of the stadium, another American, Fred Lors, took a turn in the lead. Now, Fred seemed to make his living as being a bit of a clown, a bit of a joker, and he was notorious for this. And as we'll learn later on in this race, he kind of made a joke of it and himself as well. So the runners did their 5 laps of the stadium, and once they left the stadium, the race continued on country roads. And this was a problem. This was a problem because the vehicles and horses ahead whirled up huge dust clouds. Athletes couldn't see a thing, and many were physically sick. They also had to traverse the general public. Cars, pedestrians, spectators, officials, doctors, animals. None of it was like a race today. It wasn't marked off or taped off. There was just little red flags that John Sullivan had put down, but it was out in public. And it was also blazing hot. The race happened in the middle of the day at 3 p.m. and was nearly 32 degrees Celsius, or 90 degrees Fahrenheit for my American friends. About a mile out from the stadium, Newton was leading the race with Miller behind. And behind them was Lors and another character named Felix Carvajal. Carvajal was a Cuban mailman who'd arrived at the race in a long sleeve shirt, pants and heavy shoes. He was dressed kind of formally. He also had a big mustache. Carvajal had raised the money to enter the race by running exhibition races in Cuba. But when he travelled from Cuba to St. Louis, he stopped off along the way in New Orleans. And he gambled all the money he'd raised away before he could get to the race. So he actually had to hitchhike the rest of the way. Close behind that pack were the 2 South Africans, Twanyane and Mashiane. Twanyane was chased off course by wild dogs for over a mile and still continued on and completed the race. And as we mentioned earlier, John Sullivan believed in purposeful dehydration. So what that meant was there was no water, no drink station until mile 12 of the race. So for 12 miles, these men ran in the blazing heat without any water or fluids. Conditions were so bad, some athletes resorted to drinking from creeks at the side of the road. Fred Lorse suffered severe cramps, and at mile 10, he flagged down a car. It was probably his trainer's car, but that car took him roughly another 11 miles, cheating the other athletes. A very brazen move. The Cuban, Felix Carvajal, stopped at an orchard for a snack. And apparently he ate a lot of rotten apples, which gave him terrible cramps in his stomach. So he lay down for a nap shortly after. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I do all the production, research, editing and mixing, everything myself. And I really appreciate every listener that I get. You can support the podcast by joining my Patreon for just $5 a month, where you get access to some bonus content. I'm also on social media and YouTube. I'm glad you are enjoying It Happened Like This, and I'm very thankful for your support. Now back to the episode. About halfway through the marathon, the American Meller was leading. Newton and Hicks were in second and third place. Meller had been the favourite coming into the race, but at around mile 16, he started to slow up, whether it was due to cramping or the conditions. He slowed up. Another story is that he had taken a wrong turn and tired himself out trying to get back on course. He got lost, essentially. And he soon dropped out of the race. So Hicks took the lead and Newton behind. After another few miles, near mile 19, William Garcia, who was in fourth place, collapsed. On the side of the road, he began coughing up blood. He passed out before he was discovered and taken to the hospital. He suffered a torn stomach lining and a dust-filled esophagus. Lors, after riding in the car for 11 miles, decided to run the last few miles on foot into the stadium and across the finish line to claim victory in just under 3 hours. But as he was trying to collect his winning medal and about to give his victory speech, a spectator revealed that Lors had driven along the course and he outed Lors as a cheat. Lors tried to joke it off, but it was too late. And the cheating earned him a lifetime ban, which was actually overturned after only a year, but he was banned for a while anyway. As for the other athletes who hadn't cheated by hopping into a car, next along was Hicks. He was leading with roughly 4 miles remaining in the race, but he was suffering desperately from dehydration, and his team, desperate for him to win, decided to help him out. In the first recorded instance of performance-enhancing drug use in the Olympics, Hicks was fed a combination of egg whites and strychnine. In high doses, strychnine is used as rat poison, but they gave it to him, and apparently they also gave him some brandy, and it worked. He finished the race in first place. Barely. He was hardly able to stand, he was hallucinating, and if the doctors hadn't have been there, he probably would have died. He was treated there in the stadium by the doctors. He'd lost over 8 pounds over the course of the race. The funny thing is, strychnine continued to be used as a performance-enhancing drug in the years after, and it wasn't banned until 1928. It's still banned today by the World Doping Agency. Albert Corey finished second. Newton took third place. Carvajal's recovery nap in the orchard obviously worked because he managed to bag fourth place. Tognane took ninth and Masciani was 12th. Tognane probably would have finished higher up if he hadn't have been chased off course by wild dogs. After the podium finishers, athletes trickled in for hours, but ultimately only 14 men completed the race. Less than half then started. After the race, feelings were mixed. Sullivan tried to hail it as a victory of white supremacy. Despite the fact that the majority of the athletes were white, and the two only competing black men finished the race with no formal training, while their other white South African teammate didn't finish. The race became known as the man-killing event, and seeing the way the press was leaning, Sullivan tried to jump on the bandwagon and called for it to be removed from the Olympics. The winner, Hicks, like many of the athletes, was actually never heard from or raced again. Some did, however. Albert Corey won the Chicago Marathon in 1908. Newton actually competed in other events in the 1904 Olympics and actually won gold in a 4-mile team race. Lors, who had been given a lifetime ban, well, that ban only lasted a year, and he won the Boston Marathon in 1905. The most colourful character in the race, Felix Carvajal, competed in the 1905 St. Louis Marathon and took third. The following year, he was due to travel to Greece for another marathon but disappeared halfway in Italy and was presumed dead. Several months later, he appeared in Havana and continued racing. In the years that followed, marathons would become more standardised and more water stations were included. The next Olympic marathon was actually in London in 1908, and you can actually watch clips of that marathon online. Personally, I love the Olympics. I think it's a spectacle that rolls around every 4 years, and yes, it has its controversies with doping and drugs and politics come into it, but as a spectacle, it's something I always watch, and I just find it fascinating. And I find it fascinating that these events were happening 100 years ago and will happen for another 100 years. The other thing I like about the Olympics is when I think back on it over the years, because it doesn't happen every year, it happens every 4 years. Whenever I see highlights of past Olympic Games, I remember where I was at that time in my life. So it's like markers of different periods of my life. I'm not sure that there's, apart from maybe the World Cup, I'm not sure that there's anything else like it. I guess it's funny that the two people who won were cheaters. And in some ways, many things haven't changed in when we look at cheating in the Olympics, what some countries, nations, teams will do to have their athletes be number one. We've seen over the years, they'll go to great lengths. So maybe it's no surprise that this was happening 100 years ago. But this race has all the elements of a movie. And some of the characters are so interesting. It's definitely the craziest race I've heard of, but I'm sure there are more out there and I will look for them and explore them. But this race fascinated me. From the men who gave everything to be part of it, from the conditions, the background of the fair, it was just crazy. And to be part of that time it must have felt like the whole world was there at the fair, and it must have felt like this race was the most important race of your life. I imagine for the South African athletes, they were probably somewhat forced into taking part, and I think they proved the point. I think John Sullivan's arguments didn't hold any weight, and thankfully sport is a lot more inclusive these days, even though there are still a lot of issues in different sports with inclusion and racism. This was an extreme version of that. So that's the story of the 19 04 Olympic marathon.